Imagine the exact moment when grief transforms into something far more dangerous. Not rage, but cold mathematical calculation about how to make your enemy's death last as long as anatomically possible. 865 AD. Inside a Danish longhouse, four brothers received news that their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, had been thrown into a pit of vipers by King Aella of Northumbria, dying slowly while snake venom destroyed his body from inside. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye didn't scream or weep, he just kept paring his fingernails with a small knife, cutting past the nail, through skin, straight down to solid bone, not even feeling it. Across the table, Bjorn Ironside gripped a chess piece carved from bone until it exploded in his fist, shards driving deep into his palm, blood dripping onto the board. This wasn't grief. This was the exact second the revenge of the Great Heathen Army began with a declaration of systematic extermination. By the end of this, you'll understand how hundreds of Viking longships transformed revenge into conquest, why King Aella died conscious during the Blood Eagle ritual where his ribs were broken outward like wings and lungs pulled through the opening, and how one crippled genius named Ivar the Boneless engineered the most sophisticated military campaign in Viking history. Think about the scale. This wasn't a raid for silver or slaves. This was a floating city of warriors, smiths, women, children, and horses coming to dismantle England kingdom by kingdom. King Aella thought he was ending a threat by killing Ragnar. In reality, he was lighting a fuse that would burn through 3 of England's 4 kingdoms in less than a decade. To understand the brothers' reaction, you must understand the insult's magnitude. The messenger confirmed that King Aella hadn't just killed Ragnar, he had tortured him for entertainment. He'd thrown the legendary Viking into a snake pit to die slowly, humiliatingly, stripped of armor and glory. Aella wanted to prove Ragnar was just a man who could scream like anyone else. But with his dying breath as venom took hold, Ragnar laughed at his killer and choked out one final prophecy. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. Aella thought he was ending a threat. He forgot that the old boar had sons, and those piglets were now the most dangerous warlords in Europe. The reaction in Denmark was immediate and terrifying. There were no tears, no funeral games, only mobilization. Sigurd pulled the knife from his bone. Bjorn wiped blood from his hand. They sent out a call that reached every corner of the Viking world, from Norway to Ireland. This would not be a raid. This was extermination with a single brutal purpose. Warriors flocked to their banner from Sweden, Norway, Ireland. Ancient rivals put aside feuds. Mercenaries refused payment just to be part of it. They were all drawn by the magnitude of the target. King Aella believed he was safe in his stone fortress across the sea. He had no idea he'd just summoned a force unlike anything England had ever seen. The Great Heathen Army was launching, and they were coming to ensure every single person involved in Ragnar's death would die screaming. Late 865 A.D. Sentries on the coast of East Anglia looked out and saw something that stopped their hearts. Usually a Viking alarm meant 3, maybe 5 longships, fast hit-and-run raiders. This time, the horizon itself seemed to be moving. Hundreds of dragon-headed prows cut through the mist like a migration of death. This wasn't a raiding party, it was a floating city. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply refers to it as the Great Host. It wasn't just warriors, it was smiths, women, children, horses. They weren't coming to steal silver and leave. They were coming to take the land, burn the crops, and dismantle the kingdoms of England brick by brick until nothing remained. And at the head of this massive force was not the strongest brother Bjorn or the most stoic Sigurd. It was the cripple, Ivar the Boneless. History has debated for centuries why he was called boneless. Was it brittle bone disease, inability to walk, or metaphor for his unnatural flexibility in combat? The sagas tell us he was often carried into battle on a shield, but make no mistake, Ivar was the brain of the operation. While his brothers were fueled by rage, Ivar was fueled by cold mathematical cruelty. He understood that to kill a king like Aella, you didn't just need axes, you needed strategy. Ivar knew that Northumbria was too strong to attack directly from the sea, so he made a move that confused everyone. He didn't sail north to Aella. He landed his massive fleet in East Anglia, bypassing his target. Why? Because Ivar was playing the long game. He terrorized the locals of East Anglia not into fighting, but into submission. He demanded horses, turning his seaborne infantry into mounted cavalry. He spent the winter gathering intelligence, sharpening blades, letting the fear of his presence drift north like a plague. He was letting King Aella wait. He was letting the dread build. Ivar knew that the anticipation of pain is often worse than the pain itself. By the time snow melted in 866, the Great Heathen Army was no longer just a mob of angry Vikings. Under Ivar's command, they had become a professional machine of war, mounted, supplied, and hungry. They turned their eyes north. The little piglets were done grunting. It was time to hunt. While the Great Heathen Army sharpened its axes in East Anglia, the Kingdom of Northumbria was busy destroying itself, the perfect storm. The Northumbrians were embroiled in bitter civil war. The usurper King Aella, the man who killed Ragnar, was fighting against the rightful king, Osbert. They were so consumed by hatred for each other that they didn't notice the shadow creeping up from the south. Civil war is a gift to an invader, and Ivar the Boneless accepted it with open arms. In autumn 866 AD, Ivar made his move with terrifying speed. He marched the army north, utilizing the horses he'd extorted from the East Anglians. They moved with speed that shocked the English, bypassing smaller villages, aiming straight for the heart of the north, the ancient Roman city of York. But Ivar didn't just choose the target. He chose the time with genius precision. He waited for November 1st, All Saints' Day. Consider the brilliance. On All Saints' Day, the entire noble class, military commanders, and bishops would be gathered inside cathedrals. They would be unarmed, distracted, deep in prayer. They were expecting a feast and divine protection. What they got was the heathen army. The Vikings struck York while church bells were still ringing. The city's defenses were manned by skeleton crews. The gates were breached before Northumbrian leaders even finished their hymns. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre in a sanctuary. By the time the sun set on All Saints' Day, the capital of the north had fallen. But Ivar didn't burn York to the ground. That would be the mistake of a common raider. Instead, he occupied it, repaired the Roman walls, stocked the granaries, turned York into a Viking fortress deep in enemy territory. He sat on Aea's throne and waited with infinite patience. He knew that the fall of York would force his enemies to stop fighting each other and come to him. He was counting on it. He wanted Aella and Osbert to unite. He wanted them to bring their armies to the walls of York. Why hunt the mice when you can put down cheese and wait for them to come to the trap? It took 4 months for the Northumbrians to swallow their pride. 4 months of watching a heathen army sit in their capital, eating their food and mocking their gods. Finally, in March 867, AD, King Aella and his rival Osbert shook hands. They combined their forces into a single massive army. It was a crusade before the word truly existed. They marched on York convinced that God was on their side, ready to drive the pagans back into the sea. On March 21st, Palm Sunday, the Northumbrians attacked. At first, it looked like victory. The Northumbrians slammed into the old Roman walls of York with the fury of desperate men. They found gaps in the defenses. They broke through the gates. A cheer went up from the English ranks. They poured into the city streets, thousands of them, flooding the narrow alleyways of York, thinking they had the Vikings on the run. But they didn't understand who they were fighting. Ivar the Boneless hadn't lost the walls. He had abandoned them on purpose. He had invited the English inside. As soon as the bulk of the Northumbrian army was squeezed into the tight, winding streets of the city, the trap snapped shut. The Vikings appeared on the rooftops. They emerged from side streets. They locked their shields at both ends of the main avenues, turning the city of York into a claustrophobic kill box. The advantage of numbers vanished. In the close quarters of urban combat, the long spears of the English levies were useless. It became a brawl of axes and knives. The panic set in immediately. The Northumbrians were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons. They were butchered where they stood, unable to retreat or advance. King Osbert, the rightful heir, fought bravely but was cut down in the chaos, his body trampled into the mud of the city he tried to save. The crusade had turned into a slaughter. But amidst the carnage, the Vikings had specific orders. There was one man who was not to be killed.